Okay, great. Well, we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for being here. Yeah, my name is Fanny. I'm based in Lenape-Ho-King, known as Philadelphia. I am facilitating and moderating this event. I have a background in journalism myself. I worked as a science and environment reporter for the New York Times and WHYY, which is Philly's NPR affiliate. And then I transitioned out of journalism for a number of years to help run a community seafood business here in Philly. And from there, I became the comms director at the North American Marine Alliance, or NAMA, which is, we are the ones hosting this event. And so, for context and for transparency, I want to share about our work. NAMA is an advocacy org led by community based seafood providers. What do we mean by community based? We mean people who live and work in the communities where they fish or farm seafood, often intergenerationally. They run small and medium scale operations that match the scale of the ecosystems where they fish and farm. They are ecological experts attuned to the particular rhythms and nuances of their place, and they are part of the social fabric of their communities. So NAMA was founded by such fishermen in the 90s who wanted to advocate for more ecosystem-based and community-based fisheries management. They felt that a lot of decisions were being made about the oceans and fisheries that did not include their input as some of the people best situated to steward those things. So, as NAMA, we've always worked in wild fisheries, making the distinction between corporate driven factory scale fishing and community based fishing. Over the years, we heard more and more about aquaculture from our communities. So, what is aquaculture? You can go to the next slide. It's the cultivation of seafood, including finfish, shellfish, or kelp in the ocean, freshwater, and even on land in land-based facilities. We helped release this really great report that I think is very comprehensive. So you can check that out, the footprint of farmed seafood. Um, in 2013, for the first time, the volume of seafood produced by aquaculture worldwide exceeded the volume of seafood caught in the wild. Over the last several years, we've really committed to doing more work on aquaculture with a similar approach that we have for wild fisheries, knowing that there are some forms of aquaculture that are ancient, rooted in cultural traditions, and have a low impact on the environment. Indigenous fish ponds in Hawaii are an example. And there are other forms like large scale farming of carnivorous finfish, such as salmon, that are about maximizing production, efficiency, and profit on a global scale while externalizing costs, meaning the corporations are not paying for the negative social and environmental consequences, but rather frontline communities and future generations are the ones paying the price. So, next slide. I find that often to understand aquaculture, it's helpful to look at what's happened with land-based farming. And so we can kind of think of aquaculture as being a few decades behind agriculture. Many of you likely know of the Green Revolution that happened through the last century, which involved the industrialization of agriculture. And the harmful impacts of the Green Revolution are well documented. They include land grabs or consolidated ownership of land, dependence on corporate controlled products, everything from seeds to fertilizers to equipment, and devastating impacts on the environment, including major contributions to climate change. And the claim behind the Green Revolution was that it was necessary to feed the world, but it has shown to be a false solution. Small scale food producers still feed as much as 70% of the world. So with farming, as you can see in the slide, many people know there's a difference between a family farm that's raising chickens on pasture and a factory chicken farm. But from where we're sitting, we're not really seeing the same analysis when it comes to aquaculture. Instead, we're seeing a lot of conflation and all aquaculture being put under one umbrella. Everything from a small scale oyster farm to a large scale finfish farm. And this conflation is really damaging for many reasons, one of which is that it allows the biggest corporate players to say that they're working on behalf of the small guys, when in actuality, if they succeed, there will be impacts on the smaller operations. For instance, localized infrastructure and working waterfronts that smaller aquaculture producers depend on will increasingly vanish. And we've seen this pattern play out in both wild fisheries and farming already. So, despite the failings of the Green Revolution, we're seeing, you can go to the next slide, we're seeing corporations and governments calling for a blue revolution. You'll also hear terms like a new blue economy, blue growth, blue foods, blue carbon, a lot of blue terms that we at NAMA have come to call blue washing after greenwashing. And worldwide, especially here in the US, we are at an inflection point where we're seeing this big push to rapidly develop more industrial aquaculture and embrace blue economies. So transnational corporations are looking to our shared oceans for more and more extraction, which broadly speaking, compared to land, large swaths of our ocean are still wild and undeveloped. So in the US, there are a couple powerful lobbies that are led by big agribusinesses like Cargill and JBS Foods, along with other corporations like Cisco and Merck, who are joining forces with federal agencies, some of the biggest environmental NGOs, and exerting influence over academic institutions and community groups to really push for the expansion of large-scale aquaculture in US federal waters. And to be clear, currently there is no aquaculture in US federal waters. These are waters managed by the federal government, which are typically 300 to 200 miles offshore. Closer waters are managed by state governments. So this would be really unprecedented. And what we're seeing is that these lobbies are painting a picture of industrial aquaculture as necessary for food security. But at the same time, the model that they're pushing for is based on industrial agriculture and factory farming. And we know that this model has decimated food sovereignty in so many communities around the world because it changed the way that people farm and fish from having a relationship with a wide range of diverse local seasonal foods to having a get big or get out sort of produce, having to get big or get out, produce on a commercial scale, often focus on a few species instead of a wide range of local ones for the sake of global trade and profit rather than feeding people. And we also know that there are other solutions for improving the ways we feed our communities. Some examples are protecting working waterfronts, investing in localized infrastructure for processing and distribution, embracing a wider variety of underutilized seafood that's already available, and a wider variety of techniques for preparing seafood that allows us to get as much out of each fish that we can, whether that's cooking whole fish, preserving, fermenting, things like this. So we've invited journalists to join this webinar with us because we want reporters to really have the critical tools to analyze this landscape that we're in. Next slide. Actually, you can go to the next one too. So a few years ago, we put out a report called the Aquaculture Visioning Project, and we created this with lots of input from folks in our networks to articulate 8 values for the types of aquaculture that we want to support and see more of. I'm actually just going to kind of go through the slides, so I encourage you to check that out, but I've listed the sort of 8 values in the slides. Go to the next one. I think there is a QR code. Perfect. So yeah, that's the aquaculture values report. And then if you go to the next slide, I'll give just a couple examples of the good, the bad, and the ugly of what I'm calling it. Although, of course, this is a spectrum, but some examples of what we'd consider to maybe be more values-based aquaculture are, small-scale bivalve and kelp aquaculture, aquaponic that are integrated with farms like vegetable growing. I had mentioned earlier the fish ponds in Hawaii are a really ancient form of indigenous technology and aquaculture. Next slide. Here we named just a few of some of the more problematic players to keep an eye out for, in our opinion. These players are, known for environmental, ethical, and social violations, monopolistic behavior, and are also involved in lobbying for the development of more intensive finfish farming here in the US. And actually, before we move on, that QR code goes to a really great spreadsheet. If you go all the way back to yes, that goes to a fish farm disaster spreadsheet where we've been kind of keeping track of ongoing disasters from some of the biggest aquaculture corporations. So that's a great resource. Next slide. And then I'll just leave you before I pass it to the panelists with some considerations to, questions to ask. So, in terms of who owns it, do the owners live and work in the communities where the operations run? As always, following the financial interest tells you a lot about the forces at play. Is an operation appropriately scaled so it doesn't damage ecosystems or displace other activities such as fishing? Who benefits, both in terms of where does the dollar go and who is this operation feeding? Who is harmed? I think feed, energy, water, and labor are all really great things to pay attention to, and happy to talk more about those more specifically. But without further ado, I want to get into the fish and potatoes of our webinar. So a little bit about the structure. We're going to start with a moderated panel discussion featuring our 6 speakers. And during that moderated portion, as I mentioned, we're going to close the chat soon, and we'll be using the chat to provide links and resources. You will also see my colleague Antonio doing some reactions. So that's just for the speakers to know where they're at on time, just so everyone knows. And then after the moderated section, we're going to go into an open Q&A before wrapping up. One thing I want to say, it's really important to us that this is a space for journalists. So if you are not a journalist, you're welcome to stay and listen, but we ask you to please take a back seat. So please reserve the Q&A in the chat for people who are working journalists. So to introduce our panelists, first we have Jennifer Jacquet. She's a professor of environmental science and policy at the University of Miami, as well as associate research director of the Climate Social Science Network at Brown University. She has authored dozens of research articles, as well as 2 books, Is Shame Necessary, as well as The Playbook. James Mitchell is an environmental attorney and advocate and the legislative director at NAMA and Don't Cage Your Oceans, which is a coalition of organizations and businesses fighting industrial aquaculture while uplifting community-based aquaculture and seafood. And prior to NAMA, James worked at Food and Water Watch and Greenpeace. Monique Brulette is a freelance science journalist. She is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she has written for National Geographic, The New York Times, Scientific American, Wired, and others. Karsten Petersen is a political activist and researcher at the Transnational Institute. He's based in Denmark. Before joining TNI, he served fisher movements from across the world, including Massifundise, which advocates for small-scale fishing communities in Cape Town, South Africa. And global fisher movements, particularly the World Forum of Fisher Peoples, remain close allies in his work. William Bubba Green is an oyster farmer and owner of Gullah Man Oysters based in St. Helena Island, South Carolina. His family owns the famous Gullah Grub, which is a restaurant specializing in low country Gullah cuisine. In addition to being an oyster farmer and waterman, Bubba is a cook, huntsman, and woodsman, and he actually used to own a mushroom business. And lastly, but not least, Boyce Upholt is a writer and nature critic based in New Orleans. He is the author of The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi. His journalism has appeared or is forthcoming in The Atlantic, National Geographic, and The New Yorker. And he is the founder of Southlands, a new print magazine about Southern nature and outdoors culture. Awesome. All right. So without further ado, let's start with a snapshot of the current science. So Jennifer, last October, you helped coordinate a special issue of Science Advances, which is a prestigious scientific journal that presented some of the latest research about global aquaculture. So can you share a few findings and takeaways from that issue that you wish more people knew about?
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you for setting up the event so well. Our view at Science Advances, along with Jeremy Jackson, who was co-editor of this special issue, was very much in line, I think, with some of the thoughts that have already been shared about the industry today, which is namely that You'll hear already a lot about the inevitable growth of aquaculture. You'll hear about that growth being primarily a good thing. The lens through which this growth is viewed is primarily an instrumental lens. In other words, we use these animals as resources and sort of take what we can from them. And as you all know, science is much broader than that in terms of the kind of questions it asks and the kind of values that individual scientists have. And so we titled this special issue A Broader View of Aquaculture. We were encouraging other disciplines who might not normally be part of, yeah, you feel free to advance the slide, that other disciplines who might not be part of the aquaculture discussion to address this issue right here, which is that aquaculture is growing rapidly. This is inland, and then marine waters in blue, and then capture fisheries have sort of stagnated since the mid 90s. And a lot of people have seen that growth as compensatory or complementary to capture fisheries in ways that just are not empirically grounded. For example, a lot of the aquaculture, and Femi referred to this, is carnivorous and actually relies on this capture fishery base for food. So anywhere from 20 to 30% of the fish that we catch globally each year is turned into fish meal or fish oil to feed farmed animals, including aquaculture. You can go to the next slide. So this is the special issue laid out. You can just see some of the titles here, some really neat advances just even in remote sensing and using deep learning to detect marine aquaculture in this by a similar team actually who used the same technology to detect CAFOs in the United States, or concentrated animal feed operations terrestrially. We had stuff about animal welfare risks. We had some perspective pieces, one by Carl Safina about the moral reckoning that's required to deal with aquaculture. Maybe you can advance some more. Just show a few more of the pieces. Oh, sorry, one back, yeah. The point I want to drive home for journalists, I think that's often, again, some things are said that are just taken for granted. One is that aquaculture winds up being a substitute or reduces pressure on capture fisheries. And the empirical evidence for this is just very weak. We have this why aquaculture may not conserve wild fish piece in the special issue. And there are a few other pieces of evidence to look into. I wouldn't take a claim like that for granted. For instance, with the rise of farmed Atlantic salmon, we actually saw a decrease in the price for salmon across the board and an increase in fisheries for Pacific salmon. So the idea that aquaculture will relieve pressure, again, on the ocean species is something that we need to interrogate. I want to just highlight some findings from this article that I was part of called Feeding Global Aquaculture, and you could advance the slide. The other thing that's said repeatedly is that the carnivorous or fed part of aquaculture is improving, and that we're reducing the overall what's called fish in to fish out ratio in farmed fish. So this is just a representation of the data and the range, because if you, again, look closely at that data and dig into it and look at the models and assumptions, what you see is that we've often taken in science the most optimistic and best case scenario and presented that to the media and in journals. And actually, there's a range of other alternative data sets and a range of other options where the feed ratios are anywhere from 27% higher to sometimes several orders of magnitude higher than what has been suggested by the science. So these feed ratios and the amount of wild caught fish to feed farm fish are often higher than we've assumed. And in addition, you can advance to the next slide, something that's almost always left out of the conversation is that when we are able to reduce the amount of wild fish in feed, that's often because we're using more land-based crops. So similar to cows or chickens, we're increasing the amount of corn and soy going to farmed fish that previously ate fish meal or fish oil. So again, there's no free lunch. These are fed species. In many cases, they're carnivorous, which is, again, not analogous to what we do on land. And we need to be able to talk about the feed in a more empirically grounded way. You can advance. We also I want to briefly mention that we are rapidly domesticating a whole host of species. We have 430 aquatic species produced since the start of the 20th century, and 106 of those species in just 1 decade. By comparison, we only farm about 20 species on land and really only a handful in any intensive way. I can wrap up there. We know for about half of all the species we farm, we have zero publications about their welfare, and this is what we call a major gap. It's not even a gap; it's a chasm in our knowledge and what we can provide for these animals. But again, bringing in that welfare perspective, which has been missing from aquaculture for so long, has expanded the view for aquaculture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. So as I mentioned earlier, we're at this inflection point in the US right now where we're really confronted with this question. Do we want to dramatically increase the amount of aquaculture production we're doing here in the name of food security and business? And proponents of this push point out that we are one of the biggest consumers of seafood as a country, but our aquaculture output is lower compared to other countries. So I want to turn to James now. James, can you talk about what's really driving this push in the US? Who stands to gain or lose from it? And maybe outline some of the key policies that are on the table right now that journalists should have on their radar.
Sure. Thank you, Fanny, and thank you, Dr. Jacquet. Right now, I think the best way to look at it as a journalist, if you come across a potential story on aquaculture, a good way to start analyzing these issues is start by asking where this is taking place, because there's a completely different regulatory structure that will apply to whether you're talking about something taking place in state waters or federal waters. And I'll give you some examples here. So again, as Fanny mentioned, if it's in state waters, we're primarily talking about 0 to 3 nautical miles from shore. It's a state agency that'll be permitting that activity, if at all. You got to look at who's benefiting from this, who's being left out, who's driving for this. Are local communities being consulted? Are indigenous communities being consulted? Who's really behind the money? And so when you're looking at this, you also have to look at scale and species, as was brought up earlier by Fanny as well. So for scale, are we talking about operations that will complement a coastal community, or is it going to radically disrupt existing ocean uses like recreation, fishing, tourism, conservation? And again, for species, are we talking about intensively raised carnivorous finfish, like what was just talked about, that require enormous feed inputs that can threaten global food security? Or are we talking about family-owned and operated oyster farms that don't require any feed inputs at all and could actually clean the water? So there are a lot of considerations in this space, and spoiler alert, later this year, we will be unveiling, alongside State Innovation Exchange, we'll be unveiling a state policy toolkit that will aid policymakers in understanding and evaluating these different proposals. Now, I want to pivot to federal and offshore waters. So again, you as a journalist, you come across a potential story, and this is happening outside of the 3-mile marker, so 3 to 200 miles, okay? We are now under federal jurisdiction, and there is a much smaller circle of corporations that could benefit from these activities. So in other words, in this category, we're almost exclusively dealing with powerful industry players, and this is the domain of net pens of intensively farmed carnivorous finfish, where the operators are openly discharging pollution into the ocean. And so government agencies here, like NOAA, come to play. And they, unfortunately, in this space, have been working a lot with major feed and pharmaceutical firms. And so some of the corporations mentioned earlier, like Cargill, JBS, Cisco, Bayer, and Merck, many of these corporations are part of a trade organization known as Stronger America Through Seafood, and they work with federal policymakers to sort of hide the ball with them, confuse them on what is going to actually benefit, or who is going to actually benefit from these operations. And, just to flag, as Dr. Jacquet had mentioned, the increase in land crops that are used as filler, basically, for these pellets. The Soy Aquaculture Alliance is another group out there that is working overtime now to find more animal mouths to shove more soy into. They're in a bit of a predicament now because, as you may have seen, China has closed all U.S. soybeans. So basically, in response to the Trump tariffs, the Chinese government said, fine, we won't buy any more of your soybeans. So they're working overdrive now in trying to figure out ways for fish to eat more soybean, which, never mind that fish are physiologically not equipped to properly digest soybean in the first place. And so at Don't Cage Your Oceans and NAMA, we believe that this big ag approach to aquaculture is not the answer. And that's why we're proud to work alongside coastal communities in pushing for policy proposals that more directly speak to real solutions that would meaningfully protect them. And so I'll just list two bills here today. So the Keep Fin Fish Free Act of 2025 was a bipartisan bill introduced in spring of this year by Senator Booker of New Jersey and Senator Sullivan of Alaska. And what this does is it pushes back against the administration's efforts to legislate by executive order, right? So there's no act of Congress that has actually given NOAA authority to start zoning for fish farms in our waters, in our federal waters. And this clarifies that we just can't legislate via executive order. The second bill I wanted to bring up that we're looking to reintroduce is a 2024 bill known as the Domestic Seafood Production Act that was introduced by then Congresswoman Mary Peltola of Alaska, alongside Representative Troy Carter of the New Orleans area and Suzanne Bonamici of Oregon. And what this bill does is it incorporates Keep Fin Fish Free, what I just described, and it would provide support to coastal communities that need bolstered seafood processing infrastructure. So this would directly aid fishing families and mariculture farmers, so bivalve seaweed farming, in getting their seafood to local and regional markets. I'll stop there. If time allows later, I'm happy to talk all about the seafood trade deficit, something you may have heard in the media before, but I'll pause there. Back to you, Fanny.
Thank you so much, James. All right, so we're going to move to Monique next, who is actually a journalist. So Monique, you have actually covered this debate around opening U.S. federal waters to large-scale aquaculture. In 2023, you wrote an article for Civil Eats about NOAA's plan to radically expand offshore aquaculture. And you've described this as a he said, she said story. So I'm sure all of us know aquaculture can be a polarizing topic. It's often either presented as this silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems, or it's really demonized, and there's a lot of noise. So can you tell us how you went about cutting through the noise and maybe even navigating finding a center of gravity or where the weight of evidence lies for this story? And how did you find trusted sources and data to present?
Sure. Sure. Thank you. So yeah, I wrote the story for Civil Eats. Um, do you have my slides? Nice. Thank you. Yeah. So this is a story I wrote in 2023 about the state of offshore aquaculture in the U.S. That was the assignment. And at the time, I really didn't know much about it at all. And the impetus for the story was that NOAA had released its first ever strategic 5-year plan the year before in October, outlining its national goals for sustainable domestic farmed seafood in the U.S., which included a plan for identifying sites in the U.S. federal waters that were suitable for development. Thanks to Feeney and James, I don't have to tell you what offshore aquaculture is because you guys gave a great background in it, but as you can see, when I went to research this story, there was just a lot of headlines. There was a lot of debate. This is why I'm calling it a he said, she said, because, proponents were touting the plan as a solution for the seafood deficit that we were running and kind of a solution for overfishing the seas, right? We need seafood. We're eating a lot. Let's farm it. We have this land. Okay. The opponents were saying this is just an environmental disaster waiting to happen, citing past disasters like the 2017 salmon spill in Washington that released 300,000 farm salmon in the ocean, potentially introducing disease and parasites. So, this was like a classic journalism problem that I find myself in, where there's a lot of competing claims. Both have data, both have experts. So, what do you do? I mean, the challenge isn't finding the voices, it's kind of finding the truth or at least the evidence. And I guess, so just a background, I'm a science journalist. I honestly, a lot of my reporting is about like basic biology. And so I am very comfortable diving into evidence and taking a scientific method. You know, as a science journalist, I think to myself, what do I know about science? Like, what does the science say that's going to solve this problem? And I see my role as the journalist as kind of guiding the reader through the morass of competing claims. So I guess I borrow from the scientific method. You know, I look for convergence. You know, what do multiple studies and sources say? What does peer review research say? And does any carry more weight? It's interesting, like in this story, the biggest challenge for me was that NOAA, the government agency, probably has like the bulk of research, but they're also the ones kind of dictating policy. So how it's not something you want to rely upon when you're trying to judge claims of whether or not there are environmental risks. So what I had to do, what I decided to do was talk to a lot of people. So this slide just shows you I had to talk to people in government, and not only the US government, I also reached out to Canada, and I think I reached out to Norway as well. I just looked for academics, and there were lots of advocacy groups that had great information. But again, they had a strong point of view. So I wanted to balance them also with the industry groups. And I literally talked to all these people and just kind of found out what the biggest concerns were and then tried to address it with data. Luckily, I found some academics, independent academics. Dr. Jacquet was one of them, and also another researcher from UC Santa Barbara, Haley Froelich, who actually independently validated some of NOAA's claims. She found some things were online, some things they were saying she actually backed up in her research, and some things weren't. Finding her, I thought, was really beneficial just for kind of judging the claims. And so I think that my message to you is just, you know, as journalists, I think the research is very important. I think you have to research every single claim, even the most repeated, actually, like, especially the most repeated claims. Like, don't just take it for granted because it's written everywhere. Like, when I was doing my research, all I kept hearing was, oh, there's this $17 billion deficit. Well, that was everywhere. But then when you dug into it, it turns out that's a very nuanced problem. And the deficit isn't a true deficit in the sense that the US farms a lot of seafood and they send it out for processing to other countries and then they buy it back. And these numbers can be manipulated in such a way so that it looks like an economic problem. But when you dig into it, there's a lot more to the story. Another oft-cited claim was dilution is the solution to pollution. People like kept saying that, and it's like pithy, and it's like, oh yeah, I should just believe that. Well, it's not true either. Because when you talk to the scientists, they'll tell you there can be pollution offshore, even though the waters are deeper, you know, depending on currents, depending on temperatures. It's the environment, it's messy, there's a lot going on. And basically the biggest thing I found was that there's just not enough research. And finding that there isn't enough research is also a finding in itself. So that's all I've got.
Thank you, Monique, for tackling that question. All right, we're going to actually zoom out to a global landscape. So, you know, to see if we can learn from how things have played out elsewhere. So, Karsten, you've worked with global fisher movements for many years. One of the main arguments for expanding industrial aquaculture is it's necessary for food security. But when we look at how it's played out, we see that in various ways it's been destructive for localized food systems. So can you talk about the impact of aquaculture from feed to production on coastal communities globally?
Thanks, Fanny. Indeed, I can. Pleasure to be here with all of you. I want to start off by saying that aquaculture, as Fanny already said in the very beginning, is many different things. You have a lot of freshwater aquaculture production as well, carp and tilapia, for example, especially in Asia. And that's a whole different chapter. I'm not going to speak about that. I will speak more about shrimp and salmon farming because economically these are the two biggest species of farmed seafood. And I know that the United States is one of the biggest importers of and consumers of both shrimp and salmon. what strikes me and what should strike everyone is how empirical evidence from around the world is vastly ignored. And I will bring out just a few examples of so I've worked with many fish organizations from all over the world, from all regions. And for, I would say, most of these, aquaculture is a growing threat for different reasons. So if you take shrimp, I visited a fishing community in Sri Lanka a couple of years ago, did some research there together with a fish organization in Sri Lanka. And what struck me was that there was one new shrimp producer in that local community, and just one farm providing jobs for 5 people or something like that. Created so much pollution that it wiped out the fishing for that community. So the mangrove were destroyed. 40 women could no longer go and collect wild shrimp, and about 200 fishers could no longer fish in the nearshore waters. So that's already 240 people out of the game because of one shrimp farm. And it's not just the 240 people, it's also the food they provide for many other people in the local area. So when speaking about food sovereignty or food security, it's just wild how the industry can continue to get away with these claims that they are feeding a growing population when there are actual evidence that they're doing the exact opposite. The industry will obviously say this is one rotten apple and we're going to fix that, but there are many rotten apples. So I mentioned Sri Lanka, I could speak about Thailand and India and Ecuador as well, but that's going to be another time maybe. I want us to go to West Africa as well, because in West Africa, I mean, hunger is a serious issue. It's a growing threat. Food insecurity is on the rise, and what we see is that a lot of the wild fish that is caught in West African waters, so in particular sardine, is being turned into fish meal and fish oil. So you can actually argue that for every meal we eat with salmon, 2 meals are taken out of from the people living in West Africa. So it has profound negative consequences for an enormous number of people, and not enough research, I would say, has gone into that at all. And we know that wild fish from, I mean, it's not just West Africa, it's also it's basically from all regions of the world is being turned into fish meal and fish oil. So this is, the industry is good at not addressing that particular issue, and they're very good at putting to the fore their narratives. I was asked to say a few words about blue growth as a new agenda. I will say it's actually not new. Blue revolution was mentioned in 1986 in the context of aquaculture. It was mentioned again in the 90s as a solution similar to green revolution. And in essence, because I don't have enough time to go into the details of all of this, this is a blue revolution or blue growth or blue transformation or whatever blue term is used, that is for the benefit of transnational corporations. So Cargill, Walmart supermarket chain, Movi, other actors with a big interest in aquaculture. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Karsten. All right, so we're going to actually zoom back in. Our next couple speakers are going to speak to a very localized, regionalized context. So as we named earlier, just like agriculture, aquaculture is not homogeneous. There are more regenerative ways of doing it and more destructive ways. And one of the ways that at NAMA we're hoping to support the more regenerative ways is through a project called the Atlas for Values-Based Aquaculture, which aims to create a hub of resources and to facilitate connection for aquaculture growers who value local food systems, environmental stewardship, and cultural sovereignty. So Bubba, our next speaker, has been involved in the Atlas project. And Bubba, can you
Yes.
tell us about what motivates you in your aquaculture practice and what values do you bring to your oyster farm and business?
Um, well, first off, thank you all for having me. But there are many things that motivate me in the way that I run my oyster farm. And I guess to start it off, it started from growing up as a part of the Low Country wild harvesting oysters. So one of the things that really stuck in my craw was um, here, the second half of the oyster season, most of all of your uh, wild harvest oystermen and women who do not have their own leases and pick on state grounds end up really not having any good quality product to put into the economy or into for their businesses. Reason being, the largest leaseholders actually have their pickers to pick state grounds, and then second half of the year, then they go to their private grounds. And so the unfairness of this really got to me. So I started trying to figure out how I could help the people from the community through small aquaculture farms to grow small quantities of high quality boutique style half shell oysters so that they would actually have monies to be able to continue to run their families through the late winter into the spring. And so I did my research. I definitely 100% believe in very, very low tech ways of doing things. I got that from when I was doing mushrooms. And so I took that and kind of tried to integrate it into aquaculture. I was blessed to be able to run into a great site for my nursery. So I actually grow the oysters in a nursery pond, which is a pond that used to be an old rice field. And I grow them to just about marketable size, and then they're taken out to the ocean. One of the biggest problems with growing oysters in the ocean is oysters grow best in the top half of the water column. But by growing them in the nursery for longer and then taking them out to the ocean, I'm able to have them as bottom. So I put them in bottom cages when they go to the ocean. So they spend the last few months of their life in bottom cages. And so you don't have the issues with landowners complaining about looking out of their window and looking at cages. It doesn't affect boaters as much. It does increase the amount of fouling and work that it takes to harvest these, and it also you lose a little of quite a few more oysters due to them being on the bottom. But you know, trying to figure out how to get the local oystermen and women the opportunity to increase the amount that they're able to harvest over the year, the amount that they're able to sell is two of the things that motivate me the most, as well as in my communities. I grew up on the water in woods, and I've seen a steady decline over the last 20, 30 years of people either not having the opportunity or even in un-oyster related activities that we did. We used to actually pull seine nets on the local flats because it was too shallow for shrimp boats to get there. And we've seen a decline, well, pretty much a total wipeout of that cultural way of harvesting shrimp in these areas due to more people having waterfront property, not wanting people to be near the dock, not realizing and knowing the actual rules of the ocean, which is you own from the high water mark to your property line, and not the low water mark or the banks or the shores that we would pull our nets up on. I am steady working, trying to make what I do even more low tech. Due to the fact that the aquaculture business is really, really hard for someone to break into. State regulations are unbelievable in the state of South Carolina. And then just the whole process of actually taking your farm location and putting it in the newspaper. Anyone can come out and speak out against it. So, you know, there's even a chance that another oysterman could speak out against it, especially some of the larger aquaculture farms in the Southeast. Competition is something that they really don't like. So all of those things help to motivate me and help me to want to not only help the people of the community, but help to continue to cleanse the water, because we've already found that in these areas, wild growth is unable to keep up with the demand. And the demand is so high that in some cases, people would actually even rather have an undersized oyster or here they pick a lot of clusters. So in a cluster, you have the shell that the oyster needs and other oysters need for reproduction or setting, and as well as the undersized oysters. So people are willing to buy that rather than buy good, fully grown, nice sized oysters. And I mean, that just speaks to the demand. So trying to help the local areas to be able to keep up, and trying to help clean the waters, because without the local waters, there's no shrimp, there's no fish, there's no crabs. You know, in our community of the Low Country, everything is dependent upon oysters, and so that's what motivates me and keeps pushing me forward to come up with the best practices and to not only help the environment, but to help the farmers and the community.
Thanks so much, Bubba. I'm wanting some oysters now for sure.
Say word. It's finally getting cool enough here. We're finally actually starting to have some good weather in the Low Country. And what a lot of people don't realize is, for a fisherman, it could be a bright blue bluebird day outside, but if the wind is too high, if you have strong tides, all of those things can jeopardize your health being in the boat. So it actually cuts back on the amount of time that you have to spend out there. So we're just blessed here right now to have some nice cool weather. And I know y'all see me fanning a little bit. I'm outside. We're still trying to get up the last of the shrimp that we caught this morning.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, the gnats are still out here a little bit. So, you know, a few degrees cooler and we'll be a lot more happy.
Well, I hope for good weather for y'all.
All
All
right.
right. So we're going to go from the Carolinas to the Gulf of Mexico. Boyce, you've been reporting on aquaculture in the region for a podcast called Sea Change from WWNO, WRKF, which is New Orleans and Baton Rouge Public Radio, as well as reporting on seafood stories elsewhere, including for the Food and Environment Reporting Network. So can you, Boyce, give us a picture of where aquaculture is in the Gulf? It's a little bit of like a contested region for aquaculture right now. And how do you compare operations like the smaller oyster farms that Bubba just talked about with, for instance, Ocean Era's proposed Villela Epsilon project to farm red drum in offshore waters? And has anything surprising or unexpected come up for you in your reporting?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Fanny. Yeah, so this project is for both Sea Change and the Food and Environment Reporting Network, and kind of the editors I work with at both were sort of figured that they like sort of kept seeing the word aquaculture and knew that aquaculture was becoming a hot topic down here, and so wanted to sort of dig into that. So it's been a long-term project, kind of looking at aquaculture in various ways. And you can go to appreciate Fanny adding the slide. I just launched a new venture called Southland, so I will shout that out. But you can go ahead to the next slide, which is more relevant to what I'm talking about today for Sea Change. So yeah, the Gulf is an interesting place in multiple ways on sort of multiple ends of this aquaculture spectrum that we've been talking about today. So on the one hand, we've got oysters as this example of the kind of aquaculture that there is a pretty broad consensus. This is good for the water. It when done at the small scale, it can be good for communities, good and doesn't fall into the corporate economics. And for a long time here in the Gulf, we were one of the few places in the U.S. without much of a oyster farming industry at all. So our reefs here were hit pretty hard over the past few centuries, but not quite as hard as everywhere else. And so the economics of you could still harvest wild oysters here to such an extent that nobody really got into farming until around 2010 in the wake of the BP oil spill. And at that same time, there's some technological breakthroughs. And so really in the past 15 years, there's been an explosion of new oyster farms now in every single Gulf state. And so that is sort of one thread of the reporting I'm looking at, digging into why that has happened, what that means, how that changes our culinary culture, how it changes our coastal culture. But on the other end of the aquaculture spectrum, the potentially more problematic idea of offshore aquaculture and fish pens, we here in the Gulf of Mexico have sort of always been a target site for that industry as far back as 2016. The Gulf Council, right? So the Fisheries Council that oversees the wild fisheries kind of adopted some rules in 2016 that would have opened the door to a number of industrial scale facilities in the Gulf. And that kind of fits into some of what James was talking about, right? The legal fight against that, and the fact that the Department of Commerce, which oversees the Gulf Fisheries Council, didn't have essentially the authority to do that. And then now Ocean Era, which is one of the companies that Fanny mentioned at the beginning, has a proposal on the table to make a small pilot scale farm 45 miles off the coast of Sarasota, which has received some permits and lost them and received there's a sort of ongoing legal fight there, but is definitely on track if they continue to win some legal fights to be the first aquaculture facility of any kind in federal waters. And so, yeah, looking at that as well and how that fits into the seafood industry that we have here. And Fanny, you asked about comparing these things. And one of the challenges to me was not just comparing the scale of these things, but also comparing sort of things that exist on the ground. We already have this oyster industry versus things that are at this point proposals on the table that don't exist, right? There's a lot of details about what Ocean Era will do and a lot of discussion of what that will look like, but it does not yet exist. And so kind of similar to Monique, the question that has been a challenge for me all along in this reporting process is kind of finding how to unite all of this material into one storyline. There are two themes that emerged that I noticed, and one is how all of this fits in with changes and you might say declines in Gulf commercial fishing generally in these coastal towns, right? The commercial fishing industry here is in pretty dire straits. A lot of the shrimpers are kind of talking about being the last generation to be able to do shrimping here. And so that is a big backdrop against all forms of aquaculture and the development of how do they either exacerbate that or pose a solution to that. And then the other thread I've noticed is just a general philosophical question of like, here in the Gulf of Mexico, we are a primary site of debate and decision of like, what do the oceans mean to us as a country, as a culture, right? Are the oceans going to remain a space that is, quote, wild, where we do not do domestication, where we do not do farming, or are we ready to move this sort of model that we've seen on shore and move it offshore? And I've seen people use the metaphor of farming that Fanny you used earlier to support and also to oppose aquaculture. And so that's a thread that runs through. And then just in terms of surprises, I think lots of surprises. And one that I'm being reminded of from the previous speakers is the diversity of what all of this, right? So like inherent to the challenge of the project I'm working on is the diversity of that word aquaculture and how to tell a story that contains everything from tiny oyster farms to fish pens. But even within sort of subcategories there, I think it's would behoove the rest of y'all as journalists to remember we use words like shrimpers or oystermen or things like that, and those can be very diverse groups themselves. And so I think Bill just sort of got to some of this, but right, even here in Louisiana where I live, the oyster farming industry, as it's growing, is beginning to diversify and even split, where there's some guys that are some operations that are one person, one family, but the state has started to invest money in technologies so that they can reduce the labor costs and sort of get larger scale farms that can maybe sell oysters at costs that compete with the wild oysters. And so that's potentially could create a schism within oystering community. And then even within the shrimping community, right? Here in Louisiana, we have shrimpers that tend to stay closer to shore, that tend to be smaller operations. I also went to Palacios, Texas, where their shrimp industry is large boats that go out for 45 to 60 days at a time. And those two communities are both commercial shrimpers, family traditions, but I found very different views on aquaculture in those communities. And so it's worth paying attention to sort of all of those complexities. So that's where I'll end for now. I'm happy to take questions too as we go.
Thank you so much, boys. All right, so before I have one question I want to ask all the panelists. Before we do that, I want to shout out. We did put together a short survey. It's really short and open-ended. I don't think any of the questions are required, but it will help us immensely. So please take a snapshot of that QR code, save it for later or fill it out now. And then we also have some ways to keep in touch and follow us. But we're about to transition to Q&A soon. I think while y'all are formulating your questions, maybe I'll ask each of the speakers to just spend like 1 or 2 minutes talking about or just really highlighting one thing that you would like reporters to take away or pay attention to when reporting on aquaculture. And then for everyone else, I have opened the chat back up, so you can start putting questions in the chat. I think we'll also maybe, feel free once we open it up to raise your hand and speak your question. But for now, let's hear from all of the panelists on this one question, and then we'll move into open Q&A. Let's see. Maybe we can go in the same order. Sorry, Jennifer, but if you want to go first.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to emphasize that we are seeing a lot of literature right now on food systems generally, especially vis-a-vis climate impacts and the amount of disproportionate environmental impacts by animal-based foods in general. And that's because of largely of the feed requirements on one side, and then of course, certain issues like methane specific to ruminants like cows. But in aquaculture, again, we have this issue that it's not just fed and non-fed species, which is how the FAO often thinks of it, but that there are kind of versions of carnivory that are really intense and then less intense. So, a tilapia, which could be in principle vegetarian, is still fed some amount of fish meal and fish oil because they grow faster when they receive those feeds. The same way chickens and pigs are fed fish meal and fish oil for similar reasons. But so really thinking across that, the feed requirements across so many different species, again, over 400 species under cultivation, is again one of these sort of difficulties I think in reporting on, and the ways in which the industry is really different. And I aside from bivalves, and oysters are among them in some cases, depending on how you farm them, and then of course seaweeds, there is no free lunch, and that food is coming from somewhere else in our environment, whether it's capture fisheries or the Amazon or corn and soy raised right here in the United States. Thanks.
Thank you. Let's just go popcorn. So if y'all remember your order, it's James, Monique, Karsten, Bubba, and Boyce.
Sure, and something that Monique had touched upon was the seafood trade deficit. So I want just to be sure that, journalists keep in mind whenever they see that term, you're often seeing that a bit of an altered narrative going on there, where the expectation is, well, we got to really crank up our domestic production of finfish aquaculture or any sort of aquaculture to help close that gap, because look how much seafood we're importing. Well, the part that they're not sharing is that we export well over half of the seafood that we catch here in this country. And we think that a more authentic way of closing that deficit, so to speak, is simply keep more of what we catch here and what we harvest here. And that would more authentically, you know, decrease demand for imports while also empowering our local communities. And one other fun fact for you on this argument that you'll hear, what they're not telling you as well is, let's say we go open season on finfish farming in the federal waters, that's also going to go to the export market. So, that's further showing you that's a bit of a red herring, that argument there. Thanks.
Okay, hi. So, oops. Can you hear me? Okay. So, one takeaway, okay, thank you. Yeah, I guess I would just say this is, I mean, it's fairly obvious, but I will state it. When you're looking at this issue, I think there are so many competing interests, and there's a lot of money involved and there's a lot of politics involved. I think it's just very important, if you're investigating scientific claims, to make sure you are finding independent sources, that you're finding information that is repeatable, right? You in peer-reviewed journals, just really paying attention to the quality of the source. Always check that little funding box if you're looking into something. If you're in a paper and you can scroll down and see conflict of interest, or you see who they got the grant funding from. If it's NOAA and NOAA's, proposing expanding offshore aquaculture, then you might want to think twice and maybe see if there's other sources that back that up. So yeah, be careful with the research. Obviously, follow the money. I mean, I'm sure all you journalists know this, and I'm not telling you anything new, but that was my biggest takeaway. And sometimes what you can't find is also the story. Like if you find there's not research about something, you might go digging into that, and that could be a story in and of itself. Sometimes the best stories are found in the gaps. So.
That's a good segue to me, because what you can't find in research, you can certainly, there's plenty of empirical evidence out there. So the information is there. It's just a question of who sits with that information. And this brings me to what I think is absolutely crucial that we do better and we do more of, is to look at the social and environmental costs, not the place where the seafood is actually consumed, by looking at the entire value chain. So with the examples I mentioned previously, what are the social and environmental costs of producing shrimp in Ecuador or in Sri Lanka? Same thing with the feed. So we're looking at the value chain. We have to keep an eye on feed production as well, obviously, also genetics and lots of different things when we look at the value chain. But what are the social and environmental costs in other places, in other, let's say, levels in the value chain? I think that's crucial. Thanks.
Baba, you're up.
The one takeaway I would like for people to, the one thing that I took away from this, and I would like for everyone to look at, is look at how small aquaculture farms, how they affect the community. If you can, look at the chain of where these products go, the quality of products that are coming from these smaller farms, and how much, how much of the mass produced product actually stays in those areas, just like they were saying earlier. Here we have trucks that come and load hundreds of bushels of oysters, hundreds of bushels of blue crabs, and they're gone. And so you find that people in the community in these areas, they either can't afford what stays here, or they can't even get it because it's become a desert. So that's pretty much all I would like for people to think about.
And I'll just close this out by, I mean, mine again is like Monique's sort of journalism fundamental, but one thing I've like access is the thing I would say, and that access is maybe better than you might expect. So there was sort of a big legal decision about an Army Corps permitting scheme during my reporting process, and I read a lot of stories that then concluded that the ocean era proposal was sort of going to be hit by that and not be able to move forward. And when I talked to the CEO of Ocean Air, he's like, no, we weren't even applying under that permit. And so it just struck me that a lot of journalists weren't doing the due diligence of talking to both sides. And I have found, despite the contentiousness of this issue, I've found that the aquaculture proponents are pretty open to talking as well, and talk to some land-based redfish farms, and yeah, just go in all those directions. It's worth taking a little bit of time to do that to make sure you're getting the story right.
Thank you all. So we already have a couple questions in the chat. So I think we're gonna start off with those, and then if you have a question, put it in the chat. We'll try to keep stack, or just raise your hand and we'll ask you to unmute and ask. And just as a reminder, would love to defer to journalists. So trying to keep this really a journalist-focused space. So the first question is actually for James. James, what is your take on the Bipartisan Marine Aquaculture Research and Advancement Act, or MARA Act, that was recently introduced?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So yeah, this bill just came out. It's unfortunately not great. We have a piece on it on our website to see more on it, but I'll give a quick summary here. It's basically a rebranding of the failed Aqua Act. And in fact, the very same congressional sponsors are on this bill, just like they were with the Aqua Act. And there's a couple reasons why it basically fails to meaningfully address this problem. So it would make NOAA the one-stop shop for permitting fish farms in federal waters. So there's maybe some clarity there, but the problem is this would just simply expedite the process for industry to get their cages in the water with few meaningful safeguards in place. Unfortunately, there's a lot of heavy lifting with the word research in the name of this bill. This is not research to determine whether it's a good idea, but it's research to see how we can, crank out even more fish. And so a lot of the concerns that Dr. Jacquet mentioned earlier are not being addressed by the research part of this bill. And this would use taxpayer dollars to prop up this industry, to fund commercial projects that then that company gets to sell for a profit. So they're just basically getting some subsidies in place. And finally, and kind of just sort of adding a little bit insult to injury, you're asking taxpayers to pay for propaganda. Like they're literally supposed to fund propaganda projects that will try to convince the public that the seafood that you get from these kinds of farms is just as good as the other stuff that's out there. And we think that's also a bit odd to push that narrative as well. So thanks for that question.
Does anyone else have anything to add about the MARA Act? I don't know if Jennifer, if you wanted to, but no pressure. Okay, awesome. Oh, go for it if you. Okay. All right. So we see another question about can someone talk more about the indigenous-led fish ponds in Hawaii and what makes them unique or different? I'm actually happy to talk a little bit about that. I don't know if others have, feel free to also share if others want to hop on. But aquaculture has actually been practiced in lots of communities around the world for a very long time. It's an ancestral practice in a lot of different contexts. And so it's, the Hawaiian fish ponds are one example. There's other examples of people who do very small scale cultivation in conjunction with rice paddies, or ponds where they're growing, lotus and other vegetables. With the Hawaiian fish ponds, often how they work is that there is this sort of like porous barrier, whether that be like a wall or a gate, where fish can actually swim in from the wild ecosystem, but then they can't escape. And so it's not necessarily quite the same type of operation where you're like taking brood stock that was, created in a lab, often using genetic manipulation or breeding and putting it into an operation that you're then putting a lot of input into. It's somewhere a little bit more where you're like very much like it's porous with the wild environment. And sometimes communities will cultivate algae along with the fish as like a food source, and it's multiple species. And actually, it's also been shown that sometimes these fish ponds actually helped replenish fish populations as well. And so, yeah, I think another thing to look at, like when we talked about sort of like things you can think about in terms of like who's benefiting and who is harmed, very much like the purpose of these fish ponds was to feed the local communities. It was tied with, people saw themselves as the caretakers and the guardians of these fish ponds. And so it was a way of being in relationship with place and water. And, the fish that were fished from these ponds were intended to feed the people in those communities. And so that's like also a really important thing that we encourage people to look at. Does anyone have anything else that they want to share about Hawaiian fish ponds?
I just want to add that this type of aquaculture is practiced in so many different places around the world, in particular in Asia. So it deserves some attention because there's a lot of good aquaculture happening as well. Thanks.
I don't see any immediate. Actually, yes, I see another question in the chat. Curious how you would respond to the claim of proponents of industrial aquaculture that farmed fish take fewer natural resources than chicken, beef, etc. Is that true? And if true or partly true, are there nuances you would ask journalists to be careful of when they quote this claim? So yeah, this question is talking about comparing fish with other animal protein sources and the claim that that farmed seafood is still overall lower impact on the environment. Karsten, go for it.
Yeah, that's a claim we often hear from, in particular, the big salmon producing companies. And you can say they have an argument, but what they're not telling us is the real impact. And this brings me back to the point I make about the social and environmental implications when you look at the entire value chain. What they're not telling us is the real impact of salmon farming when you look at what's happening in West Africa, for example, or other places for that matter. So it might be that it's not as harmful as beef production, but this doesn't make it a good form of production. So, I mean, that's really the bottom line. Thanks.
Does anyone else have anything they want to say about that
Yeah,
question?
I'm happy to address because we also see the claim, what I see more commonly is that, especially around climate change, so that farm fish has the lowest carbon footprint, and they like to keep the focus on the carbon equation. So I think Karsten was making this point somewhat as well, that it depends on the parameters of the models that you use. So if you're interested in just greenhouse gases, that actually may be true. That farm fish, for instance, have lower greenhouse gas emissions than beef. Chicken also has lower than beef, by the way, and gets a lot of press for that. But for instance, once you start looking at the number of animals killed to feed to that farmed animal, we don't kill any animals intentionally to feed cows. We do for chicken, pigs, and fish because we have this enormous fish meal industry. Water use can also be really manipulated. And so what we see across aquaculture happening, which I think is part of the issue that we're dealing with as journalists and scientists, is we have an enormous amount of seaweeds and bivalves, and this brings down the impacts of the more polluting species and sector of aquaculture production. So they want to take the average amount of fish in, fish out across the industry rather than looking at the carnivorous species, or they want to take the average water use or the average amount of antibiotic use. And we know that in certain species, these quantities of some of these impacts are just enormously high, even higher than chicken, beef, or pork.
I will add in just a question. I can't answer the question, but the like parallel question that I'm asking in my own reporting is sort of like, it occurs to me that that comparison of like fish to terrestrial species implicitly implies that the fish we raise in farms is going to replace those species, and that's a question worth asking too. Is like it is typically not that direct, and so can step out and do that kind of analysis as well.
There's a great paper on that I'll put in the chat, actually, by one of the authors in our special issue. Asked that as sort of about, was seafood a kind of complement to other animal flesh or additive? And they show that it's additive. We're just eating more and more animal products rather than this idea that chicken, for instance, substitutes for beef. And part of that is that related to that slide that I showed too, that once you have these industrial processes and infrastructure, demand and supply actually get really decoupled in these global systems in ways that I think are really interesting too. So I'll find that and put it in the chat.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I don't see any immediate questions, and I wanted to just address, there's been some comments in the chat from someone named Johnny Fishmonger. For context, Johnny is someone who's been in our networks for a very long time. We've organized and collaborated with him, particularly around fighting factory trawlers. At NAMA, we're working with very pluralistic communities and trying to build a very broad movement. And so, we've worked, for instance, with some community-based seafood businesses that have made the choice to sell farmed fish, including farmed salmon, because it's what consumers want. And they have decided to do so to help run their business. And so this is an example of something that I think can cause a lot of disagreement internally among our networks. And I'll also just say, I mentioned at the top, we are moving from organizing primarily with wild fishing communities to now working more in aquaculture and working with community-based aquaculture farmers. And there's also a lot of tension around that. There are fishermen in our networks who are really unhappy that we're working with aquaculture growers at all, because they see aquaculture inherently as displacing their livelihoods. The way that we see it is that small scale aquaculture farmers and small scale fishermen actually have more in common with each other than they do with their industrial counterparts in either wild fisheries or aquaculture. But all to say, there's like a lot of moving at the speed of trust and internal conversations that we navigate. So I know that Johnny had mentioned in the chat several times some of his critiques, and I welcome you to contact him if you want to and talk to him about his perspective. But yeah, just wanted to address that.
I'll just add, Fanny, because I think that's really interesting, and I really appreciate you being sort of transparent about the sort of theory of change, because we all come at this with different theories of change. But one thing that isn't very well established in the science either is what portion of global aquaculture is industrial produced and is small scale. This is not in the FAO data set, and it's something we really need to get our kind of head around as a community and as certainly as the scientists. And we do have that for fisheries, what is considered subsistence, small scale, and industrial by the country itself. We don't have that for aquaculture, and it's a major gap in our knowledge, because it's hard to operationalize that theory of change or work with it in these models without that kind of designation. So we kind of need to think about, like, what is industrial aquaculture? Is it about the capital involved, the densities, and have these definitions at least nationally, so that we could do that globally.
That's awesome. That's some of the work that we're really interested in exploring through the Atlas project, and like knowing that that is something that researchers are also identifying as a need is really, really important.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
Because it's a very important point. And yes, it might be right that there's a lot of data in the Food and Agricultural Organization on catches from small-scale fishing around the world. But that data comes from fisheries departments from all the different countries around the world. And in most of these countries, they don't really give political priorities to small-scale fishing, and they don't have good systems for collecting data from small-scale fishing. So the data that feeds into the FAO database on small-scale fishing is, I would argue, in many cases actually not reliable. But this also brings me to another crucial point, and that is that when speaking about aquaculture, when we look at who are all the different actors and players who are dominating the political arenas and who are dominating economically, then it is not small scale producers. And there's very little interest in small scale producers. And having followed the processes in the FAO for quite a number of years and how they're pushing aquaculture, it is very clear that they're not pushing small scale aquaculture. This is about big industry. This is about big business. And so I think that's also very important to be mindful about.
Thank you, Karsten.
Can I add a little bit to what he's
Yes.
saying, especially being a small scale person? I see on a regular basis that the little guy gets left out. And what I call small scale is, oh, well, no, not what I call small scale, but what small scale does for especially this area. People like to know where their food comes from. And the way that we harvest, wild harvest small scale, here we're in the mud to our knees with hammers and rakes, and that's how we harvest the oysters. And even in the aquaculture here, we are harvesting from bottom cages. So, you know, a larger scale where they're using conveyor belts and putting out millions of seed and, you know, harvesting millions of oysters. They do definitely, well, they're producing the most money, so the state is definitely going to listen to them. Unfortunately, they're the ones that get all of the grants. They're the ones that get all of, well, majority of the help, because I have been fortunate enough to get a few of those, but they get majority of the help. And so it kind of weeds out the small scale guy. And so that actually goes more from just fishing. That goes to who owns homes, who owns land, who owns anything in these small communities. So small fishing communities are falling by the wayside and actually disappearing everywhere. You know, I spoke to someone who said there's a couple small scale places up north where rent in these areas are $2,500 a month for a one-bedroom studio. So how can the fishermen even sustain themselves and be able to live in these areas? So when they end up having to move further and further out, sooner or later they're gone. And then the only person that's there are these big boats that go out, like you said, for weeks at a time and gobble up everything they can. And you know, it would be something if some of the bycatch that they're using, that they're throwing back, can also be used for other things, but that isn't even done. It's just waste on top of waste. So even in the wild harvest, there's still a lot of waste. There's still a lot of bad things that are happening.
Thank you for that, Bubba. Well, we're down to our last minute, so I'm actually just going to wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining. A huge, huge thanks to our panelists. What an incredible wealth of knowledge you've shared with us. I want to tease, we have some exciting resources we're releasing soon. We're coming out with a investigative series on a corporate profile, so looking at some of the biggest corporate players in aquaculture. So that'll be coming down the pike, and as well as that state policy toolkit that James mentioned, that really gives a rundown on state level legislation. We will share this recording and resources with folks who registered, and maybe we could just put that post-webinar survey in the chat. Please save that, and if you can spend a couple minutes just to fill that out, we'd be very grateful. So thank you all for spending an hour and a half with us. And yeah, I hope that you learned something. Thank you so much.
Thank everyone for having me. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bubba.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.